The doors of the great hall slammed shut before Lily Bennett could even set down her bag. Every guard in the room turned toward her at once, and she felt her heartbeat rise into her throat. She had only been standing beneath the stone seal above the throne for 11 minutes, and already the whole pack was staring at her, as if she had lit a fire in a room full of dry paper. She had arrived at Hallowmere only that morning, carrying a single letter of permission signed by the council and a bag full of notebooks. She was a linguist, trained for years in the study of forgotten languages, the kind of words that most people believed had died out with the old world. She had spent her whole life chasing symbols carved into stone, wood, and bone, translating messages that no living person could read anymore. When the invitation came to study the ancient markings inside the Hallowmere throne room, she had not hesitated for even a second. She had heard stories about the pack, of course. Everyone had. Hallowmere was one of the oldest and most guarded packs in the region, ruled by a young alpha king named Ronan Ashford, a man known for his calm face and his sharp, unreadable eyes. People said he rarely smiled, and that he trusted almost no one outside his own bloodline. Lily had expected distance. She had expected silence. She had not expected to be looked at like a threat within her first hour inside the hall. She stood very still, watching the guards exchange glances, unsure if she should speak first or wait. The hall itself was breathtaking, tall stone walls rising into shadows, ancient banners hanging from the ceiling, and at the far end, a throne carved from dark wood that looked older than the walls around it. Above the throne, carved directly into the stone, was the seal she had come to study. It was large, circular, filled with symbols that curled and twisted like ivy, unlike any script she had studied before, and yet strangely familiar, as if her mind already knew fragments of it from some old memory buried deep inside her training. A guard finally stepped forward, his expression tight and formal. He introduced himself as Finn Cole, captain of the hall guard, and told her that her permission had been reviewed, though not without concern. He explained, in a low voice, that no outsider had been allowed this close to the throne seal in living memory. Scholars had asked before. All had been refused. Lily was the first exception, and clearly, not everyone here agreed with that decision. She thanked him, and tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she opened her notebook. She was used to old temples and empty ruins, not living halls full of watching eyes. Still, the symbols above the throne pulled at her curiosity, stronger than her nerves could hold her back. She stepped closer, tilting her head, studying the way each line connected to the next. It was late afternoon when the Alpha King finally entered the hall. Lily heard him before she saw him, the sound of the great doors opening, followed by a hush that spread through the guards like a wave. She turned, and found herself looking at a tall man with dark hair, dressed simply, but carrying himself like someone used to command, without needing to raise his voice. His eyes moved to her immediately, sharp and assessing, as though he were trying to determine what kind of person would dare come this close to his family's oldest secret. He did not greet her warmly. He simply asked her name, and when she gave it, he asked why she was standing so close to the throne. She explained her purpose, the letter of permission, her research into ancient Pack dialects. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and then told her, in a voice that left no room for argument, that she could study the outer halls and the recorded texts in the library, but she was not permitted near the throne seal without direct supervision. Lily wanted to protest, but something in his tone told her this was not a discussion. She nodded and stepped back, watching him turn and walk toward the throne, glancing briefly up at the seal before looking away, almost as if he could not stand to look at it for too long. It was a small moment, barely noticeable, but Lily filed it away in her mind. People who were truly indifferent to something did not look away from it like that. Over the following days, she was given access to the Pack's library, a quiet stone room filled with old scrolls, leather-bound records, and fragments of texts collected over centuries. She spent long hours there, cross-referencing symbols, comparing them to the oldest dialects she knew, searching for any clue that might explain the meaning of the seal above the throne. She found scattered references to it in old records, always brief, always vague, as if generations of scribes had been trained to write around it rather than through it. She met a young woman named Nora Pike, one of the Pack's record keepers, who seemed far more open than the guards had been. Nora explained that the seal had always been considered decorative, a piece of old art rather than an actual message. Most in the pack believed it simply marked the founding of Halomir, nothing more. When Lily mentioned that she suspected it might be an actual written language, Nora looked surprised, then thoughtful, and finally quietly warned her to be careful about what she said out loud in the halls. Lily asked her why, and Nora hesitated before answering. She said that some things in Halomir were better left unspoken, especially anything connected to the throne. She did not explain further, but the warning stayed with Lily long after their conversation ended. Despite the tension in the air, Lily could not stop herself from being drawn back to the throne room every chance she got. She found small ways to study the seal from a distance, sketching what she could see from across the hall, comparing the shapes to older symbols she had studied in her research. She began to notice patterns, groupings of markings, that repeated in specific places, almost like punctuation. It was a language, she was now certain of it, not decoration. And it was old, older than most of what she had studied before. One evening, as the hall emptied and the guards changed shifts, she found herself alone near the throne for the first time. She knew she was not supposed to be there without supervision, but the pull was too strong to resist. She stepped closer, notebook in hand, and began comparing the seal directly to her research, matching curve for curve, symbol for symbol. Her hands moved quickly, sketching, translating fragments in her head as she went. She had barely gotten through a portion of the outer ring of symbols when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting a guard, and instead, found the Alpha King standing a few steps away, watching her with an expression she could not quite place. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something closer to alarm, quickly hidden behind a calm mask. He asked her, quietly, what she was doing. She explained, honestly, that she had noticed patterns in the seal, and could not resist a closer look. She expected him to scold her, perhaps even remove her from the estate entirely. Instead, he stood silently for a long moment, studying her face, as if trying to decide something important. Finally, he asked her a question she had not expected. He asked if she could actually read it, not guess at it, not theorize about it, but truly read the words carved into the stone. Something in his voice had changed, quieter now, almost cautious. Lily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something about the moment felt important, like a door had opened slightly, and she needed to decide whether to step through it. She told him the truth. She said she believed she could, given enough time, translate most of it. She admitted she had already recognized several key symbols, ones tied to old ceremonial language used in ancient pack bonding rituals. She watched his jaw tighten slightly at her words, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something behind his composed expression that looked almost like fear. He did not answer immediately. He turned instead to look up at the seal himself, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost private, as if he did not want even the empty hall to overhear him. He told her that no one had ever gotten this close to understanding the seal before, not in his lifetime, not in his father's lifetime. He asked her, directly, if she understood what that meant. Lily admitted she did not fully. She only knew that whatever the seal said, it clearly mattered a great deal to him, more than simple curiosity about old artwork would explain. She watched him closely, waiting for him to either open up further or shut the conversation down entirely, the way he had done so easily on their first meeting. Instead, he surprised her again. He asked her to continue her work, but only under his direct supervision, no one else present. No records shared with the council until he had seen them first. It was an unusual request, one that clearly went against the earlier restrictions placed on her. But she agreed without hesitation. She was too curious now to turn back, and something about the seriousness in his voice told her that this was no longer simply about research. It was about something the entire pack had been avoiding for generations, something hidden in plain sight above their own throne. As she gathered her notebooks that evening, she caught him glancing at the seal one more time before leaving the hall, his expression tight, with something she could only describe as quiet dread. Whatever secret was carved into that stone, she realized, was one he had spent his whole life trying not to look at too closely. And now, because of her, he no longer had a choice. She walked back to her guest quarters that night, with her notebook clutched tightly to her chest, her mind racing through every symbol she had seen, every pattern she had matched. She barely slept, her thoughts circling back again and again to the strange mixture of fear and hope she had seen cross his face in that quiet hall. Whatever answers waited inside that ancient seal, She now understood one thing clearly. The Alpha King needed to know them just as badly as she wanted to translate them, even if some part of him was terrified of what they might reveal. The next morning, she woke before sunrise, eager to return to the hall, unaware that the answers she was chasing would soon change everything she thought she understood about Hallowmere, its throne, and the man who ruled over it, with a secret carved silently above his head for as long as anyone could remember. Lily returned to the hall just as the first light touched the tall windows, and she found Ronan already waiting near the throne, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the pale morning glow. He did not greet her the way most people greeted a guest. He simply nodded once and told her they had limited time before the council arrived for their weekly gathering, and that whatever she saw today needed to stay between the two of them until he decided otherwise. She agreed, though the request sat strangely with her. She had never worked under conditions like this before. Secrecy layered over secrecy. A powerful man asking a stranger to keep silent about something even he seemed afraid to name. Still, she set her notebook on the small table beside the throne and began her work, moving slowly along the lower ring of the seal, the part she had not yet examined closely. The symbols here were smaller, more tightly packed, clearly written by a different hand than the outer ring. She recognized several markings immediately, ones tied to old ceremonial phrases used during pack founding rituals, the kind of language reserved for oaths meant to last generations. She spoke her observations aloud as she worked, partly for her own clarity, and partly because she sensed Ronan wanted to understand every step of her process, even the uncertain parts. He listened closely, standing near enough that she could feel his attention on her, though he said very little. Every so often he asked a question, sharp and precise, testing whether her translations were guesses or certainties. She found herself explaining her methods more thoroughly than she normally would with a client, walking him through the roots of each symbol, the way ancient dialects borrowed and reshaped meaning over centuries. To her surprise, he absorbed the information quickly, asking better questions than most trained scholars she had worked with before. As the morning stretched on, she noticed a change in the way he watched her work. His arms uncrossed, his shoulders, tense since the moment she had arrived days earlier, eased slightly. He still watched the seal itself with caution, almost the way someone watches an old wound they are afraid to touch, but his attention toward her had softened into something closer to quiet trust. By mid-morning, she had translated enough of the lower ring to recognize a repeating phrase, one that appeared 3 times in slightly different forms. It referenced something called an unclaimed line, along with a phrase she translated roughly as a promise sealed in silence. She read the words aloud carefully, watching Ronan's face the entire time, and saw him go very still, his jaw tightening the way it had the night before. He asked her to repeat the phrase again, slower this time. She did, and watched him turn away from her, walking a few steps toward the throne, his hand resting briefly against the old wood, as though searching for balance. When he turned back to her, his voice was quieter than before, almost private, as though the walls themselves might be listening. He told her that the phrase she had just translated matched a story he had heard only once, whispered to him as a child by his grandmother, a story the rest of the pack treated as nothing more than an old superstition. According to the story, the founding of Hallowmere had not been peaceful. There had been 2 brothers, both claiming leadership after their father's passing, and only one had ultimately taken the throne. The other, according to the whispered tale, had vanished from all official records, his name erased entirely from the pack's history. Lily felt a chill move through her at his words. She asked carefully whether he believed the seal above the throne might be connected to that vanished brother, and Ronan admitted, reluctantly, that he did not know, but that the timing and language matched too closely to be a coincidence. If the seal truly recorded a promise tied to an unclaimed bloodline, it meant the founding story every pack member had grown up believing might be incomplete, or worse, deliberately rewritten. She could see the weight of that realization settling over him, and for the first time since arriving at Hallowmere, she understood the depth of what she had stumbled into. This was not simply an academic curiosity. It was a question that touched the very foundation of his right to rule, a question buried in stone above his own throne for longer than anyone could remember. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Ronan quickly straightened, his expression sliding back into its usual calm control. A woman entered the hall, older, dressed in formal council robes, her eyes sharp and immediately suspicious as they landed on Lily. She introduced herself as Vera Holt, a senior member of the Pack Council, and asked, in a tone that made it clear she already disapproved, why an outsider was standing so close to the throne without council supervision. Ronan answered smoothly, explaining that Lily's research had been approved and that he was personally overseeing her work near sensitive areas of the hall. Vera did not look convinced, her eyes lingering on Lily's notebook for a long moment, before returning to Ronan's face. She reminded him, in a voice edged with quiet warning, that the throne seal was not simply decoration, and that certain traditions existed for good reason. Lily noticed the careful way Ronan responded, neither confirming nor denying anything specific, simply reassuring Vera that nothing improper was taking place. It was clear to Lily that whatever secrets the Pack Elders held about the seal, they intended to keep them buried, regardless of what the ancient symbols actually said. After Vera left, the tension in the room lingered like a held breath. Ronan exhaled slowly, and told Lily that the council would not react well if they learned how far her translation had progressed. He asked her to pause her work on the throne seal until he could better understand the situation, worried that pushing too quickly might create problems neither of them could easily undo. Lily agreed, though reluctantly, her scholar's instincts pulling hard against the idea of stopping, now that she was so close to real answers. Still, she recognized the danger in the room, danger that had nothing to do with symbols on a wall, and everything to do with power, tradition, and fear of change. She gathered her notebook and prepared to leave the hall for the day, her mind already turning over everything she had learned. Before she left, Ronan stopped her with a quiet question, one that surprised her with its honesty. He asked if she believed the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was worth uncovering, even if it threatened everything the Pack believed about itself. Lily considered the question carefully before answering. She told him that in her experience, buried truths rarely stayed buried forever, and that packs, like people, tended to grow stronger once old wounds were finally allowed to heal properly, rather than hidden away out of fear. He studied her for a long moment after she spoke, something shifting behind his eyes, though she could not quite name what it was. He thanked her, quietly, for her honesty, and told her he would send word once he decided how to proceed. As she walked back toward her guest quarters that evening, she found herself thinking not just about the ancient symbols waiting to be translated, but about the man who ruled over them, carrying a secret weight she was only beginning to understand. That night, unable to sleep, she pulled out her notebook again, studying her sketches of the seal by candlelight, searching for any detail she might have missed. She noticed, for the first time, a small marking near the edge of the seal that she had originally dismissed as damage from age. Looking closer now, she realized it was intentional, a separate symbol tucked away from the main text, almost hidden. It matched nothing she had seen in the outer or lower rings, and her scholar's curiosity sharpened immediately. She made a note to examine it more closely the next time Ronan allowed her back into the hall, sensing that whatever it represented might hold the final piece of a puzzle that was growing larger and more important with every symbol she uncovered. Outside her window, the Pack land stretched quietly into darkness, unaware of how close their entire history stood to being rewritten by a single hidden mark carved into ancient stone. Word came the next morning that Ronan wanted her back in the hall before the household fully woke, and Lily arrived to find the great room empty except for him, standing alone beneath the throne, staring up at the seal as though he had been there for hours already. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, the kind of tiredness that came from thinking too hard about something with no easy answer. He told her, without preamble, that he had spent the night going through old family records kept privately by his own bloodline, separate from the official Pack archives. Most of it was ordinary history, birth records, old letters, nothing unusual. But tucked inside one worn journal belonging to his great-grandmother, he found a single page that had clearly been added later, written in a hurried hand, as though the writer feared being caught. It mentioned a hidden mark near the edge of the throne seal, describing it only as the truth mark, without further explanation. Lily felt a rush of excitement at his words, quickly followed by caution. She reminded him gently that a single vague note from generations ago was not proof of anything concrete, only a thread worth following carefully. Still, she could not deny the timing felt significant, especially since she had noticed that same hidden marking herself only the night before. They approached the throne together, and Lily pointed out the small symbol tucked near the seal's edge, easily missed unless someone knew exactly where to look. Ronan studied it closely, his brow furrowed, clearly trying to understand why something so small could hold such weight in his family's private records. Lily began working through the symbol methodically, comparing it against everything she had already translated. It took time, longer than she expected, since the marking did not follow the same structure as the rest of the seal. It seemed to function differently, less like a sentence, and more like a seal within the seal. A smaller promise, layered inside the larger one. As she worked, Ronan asked quiet questions about her life outside of this assignment, perhaps trying to ease the tension building in the room, or perhaps genuinely curious. She found herself answering honestly, telling him about her early fascination with old languages, how she had spent childhood summers with her grandfather, who taught her to see forgotten scripts not as dead things, but as voices, waiting patiently to be heard again. He listened with more attention than she expected from a man carrying the weight of an entire pack on his shoulders. Their conversation was interrupted when she finally isolated the meaning of the hidden marking. She read it slowly, checking herself twice before speaking it aloud. The symbol, translated as closely as she could manage, meant witness bound by choice, not blood. It was a small phrase, but its implications were enormous. Paired with what she had translated the day before, referencing an unclaimed line and a promise sealed in silence, the picture forming was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. Ronan's reaction was immediate and quiet, his hand pressing briefly against his chest, as though absorbing a blow he had expected but still was not fully prepared for. He asked her directly what she believed it meant. Lily chose her words carefully, aware of how much weight her answer carried. She explained that, based on everything she had translated so far, it appeared the original founding agreement of Halomir might not have been decided purely by bloodline, as everyone believed, but by a chosen witness, someone selected to confirm leadership through fair judgment, rather than birth order alone. If true, it meant the entire foundation of how leadership passed through Halomir might have been altered at some point in history, buried beneath centuries of tradition that painted bloodline succession as absolute and unquestionable. For a pack that prided itself on strict lineage, such a revelation could shake the confidence many held in their current leadership structure, including Ronan's own claim to the throne. He sat down slowly on the steps leading up to the throne, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the ancient wood beneath him, as though seeing it for the first time. He admitted quietly that he had always felt a strange discomfort sitting on that throne, an unease he had never been able to explain, even to himself. Hearing her translation now, he wondered if some part of him had always sensed there was more to his family's history than the clean, simple story everyone had been taught. Lily sat beside him, though carefully keeping a respectful distance, and reminded him that uncovering an older truth did not automatically erase his right to lead. Traditions changed over time for many reasons, not always through deception. It was possible the switch to strict bloodline succession had happened for practical reasons generations ago, perhaps even with good intentions, and had simply been forgotten over time, rather than deliberately hidden. Still, she admitted, the secrecy surrounding the seal, and the council's clear discomfort with her research, suggested something more deliberate than a simple loss of history. He asked her, quietly, what she thought he should do with this information. Lily hesitated before answering, aware that this decision was ultimately not hers to make. She told him honestly that she could only offer him the truth as she translated it, not the wisdom of how to use it. That choice belonged entirely to him, as leader of his people. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of the hall doors opening. Both of them stood quickly, and Lily gathered her notebook just as Finn Cole entered, his expression tense. He informed Ronan that whispers had already begun spreading through the lower halls, rumors about a scholar working closely with the Alpha King on something connected to the throne. No specific details had leaked yet, but the pack was clearly beginning to notice the unusual attention Lily was receiving. Ronan thanked Finn for the warning, and asked him to keep watch over who came near the hall for the rest of the day. Once Finn left, Ronan turned back to Lily, his expression now carrying a new kind of urgency. He told her that time was becoming a factor now, in ways he had not anticipated. If rumors spread far enough, the council might act on their own suspicions before he had a chance to fully understand the truth himself. Lily suggested they move more quickly through the remaining sections of the seal, focusing specifically on any references to how the witness described in the hidden marking might have been chosen, and whether any similar process still existed within the current pack structure. If leadership had once been decided through fair judgment rather than bloodline alone, There might be a path forward that honored both the old tradition and the current stability of the pack, rather than forcing a painful choice between the two. Ronan agreed, though his expression remained troubled. He admitted that even if such a path existed, convincing the council to consider it would be an entirely different challenge, one that might turn even loyal allies against him if handled poorly. Still, he seemed steadied by having a clearer direction to move toward, rather than simply reacting in fear to whatever the ancient stone revealed next. As the afternoon wore on, they returned to careful, focused work, moving methodically through the remaining untranslated sections near the seal's center, the part Lily suspected held the most important information of all. Each new symbol brought them closer to understanding not just the history of Halomir, but the true weight of the choice, now resting squarely on Ronan's shoulders, a choice that would soon force its way out of the shadows, whether the council was ready for it or not. 3 days passed before Lily noticed she was being watched by someone other than the guards assigned to protect the hall. She first felt it in the library, a prickling sense of attention on the back of her neck as she copied notes from an old scroll. When she looked up, she caught a glimpse of a man standing near the doorway, watching her with sharp, calculating eyes, before stepping away quickly when she met his gaze. She mentioned the encounter to Nora later that afternoon, describing the man's appearance as best she could. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in fine clothing that marked him as someone of importance within the pack. Nora's expression tightened immediately, and she lowered her voice before answering. She told Lily the description matched Dorian Vale, a distant cousin of Ronan's family line, a man who had long believed he had a stronger claim to leadership than Ronan himself. Lily asked why, and Nora explained quietly that Dorian's branch of the family descended from an older generation, technically senior in age, though passed over generations ago, in favor of Ronan's direct line. Dorian had never publicly challenged the succession, but many within the pack knew he resented it privately, believing tradition and seniority should have placed him on the throne instead. If rumors were now spreading about hidden information tied to the throne's founding, Nora warned, Dorian would be exactly the kind of person eager to use it for his own advantage. The warning settled uneasily in Lily's chest. She had been so focused on the historical puzzle of the seal that she had not fully considered how dangerous the information could become in the wrong hands. If Dorian learned that the ancient agreement suggested leadership was meant to pass through chosen judgment rather than strict bloodline, he might use it not to correct an old wrong, but simply to seize power for himself, regardless of what the original agreement truly intended. She reported the encounter to Ronan that evening, watching his expression darken as she described the man she had seen. He confirmed Nora's account, adding that Dorian had grown increasingly vocal in recent months, quietly gathering support among council members who felt threatened by anything that challenged tradition, even as he claimed publicly to respect the current leadership. Ronan admitted that if Dorian learned about the seal's true meaning before he had a chance to properly present it to the council himself, the consequences could be severe, potentially splitting the pack into opposing factions. Determined to move faster, they returned to the hall early the next morning, focusing entirely on the center of the seal, the section Lily believed held the clearest explanation of how the ancient witness process actually worked. The symbols here were more detailed than anywhere else on the stone, densely packed and clearly written with great care, as though the original carver wanted this section preserved perfectly, regardless of how much space it required. Working steadily through the morning, Lily began piecing together a clearer picture. The center text described a ceremony, one held not by bloodline alone, but through the judgment of a chosen witness, someone selected specifically for their fairness and clarity of perception, tasked with confirming which candidate among potential heirs demonstrated true strength of character and leadership, rather than simply the oldest birthright. The witness held no personal stake in the outcome, chosen deliberately from outside the immediate family to ensure impartial judgment. Reading this aloud, Lily paused, struck by an unexpected connection. She looked up at Ronan and pointed out that her own presence at Halomir, an outsider brought in for a specific purpose, echoed strangely with the description of the ancient witness role. Ronan's eyes widened slightly at the observation, though he did not respond immediately, clearly turning the idea over carefully in his mind. Before either of them could discuss it further, the hall doors opened unexpectedly, and Dorian Vale stepped inside, flanked by 2 others Lily did not recognize. His expression carried practiced calm, though his eyes moved immediately and sharply toward Lily's notebook resting on the table beside the throne. He greeted Ronan with formal politeness that did not quite hide the tension beneath it, then turned his attention fully toward Lily, introducing himself smoothly and asking, with false casualness, what exactly the scholar had discovered so far regarding the throne seal. Ronan stepped forward before Lily could answer, his tone even but firm, explaining that the research remained ongoing and that any findings would be properly presented to the full council once verified. Dorian's smile remained pleasant, though his eyes hardened slightly at the deflection. He mentioned, almost too casually, that he had heard whispers among the staff about promising discoveries, and that as a member of the founding bloodline himself, he felt he had every right to know what was being uncovered about his own family's history. Lily remained silent, sensing the careful balance Ronan was trying to maintain, refusing to give Dorian anything concrete, while also avoiding open conflict that might escalate the situation further. After a tense exchange of polite but pointed words, Dorian eventually excused himself, though not before glancing once more toward Lily's notebook, with an expression that left her feeling distinctly uneasy. Once he left, Ronan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He admitted that Dorian's visit had not been a coincidence, and that someone within the household had likely reported details of their work directly to him. Lily agreed, and suggested they needed to be far more careful about where and how they discussed their findings from this point forward, perhaps even changing their working location to somewhere less easily observed. They decided to move their research temporarily to a smaller private study attached to Ronan's own quarters, a space few others had reason to enter. Though the change offered more security, it also meant spending even more time in close proximity to each other, something Lily noticed affected her more than she expected. Working alongside him through long hours of careful translation had slowly shifted the dynamic between them, from wary distance into something quieter and more comfortable, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. That evening, continuing their work in the private study, Lily uncovered another important detail buried within the center text. The ancient agreement specified that the witness's judgment, once given, could not be challenged by bloodline alone, only overturned by a formal gathering of the full pack, requiring near unanimous agreement to reverse the witness's decision. This detail struck both of them as significant, since it suggested the original founders had intentionally built strong protection against exactly the kind of power struggle Dorian now seemed eager to create. Ronan listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than distressed for the first time in days. He admitted that understanding this detail gave him a clearer sense of how he might approach the council, framing the discovery not as a threat to his legitimacy, but as proof of a wise system deliberately designed to protect the pack from exactly the kind of division Dorian's ambitions represented. Lily felt a small measure of relief at his renewed steadiness, though she remained aware that Dorian's interest in the seal had not disappeared simply because they had changed locations. If anything, his visit that morning confirmed, he already suspected something significant was being uncovered, and men like him rarely gave up easily, once they sensed an opportunity for power within reach. Whatever came next, she understood clearly now that their quiet research had moved far beyond simple academic curiosity, into something that would soon demand careful, deliberate action from both of them. The private study became their quiet refuge over the following week, a small room, lined with old books and warmed by a single fireplace, far removed from the watchful eyes of the main hall. Lily found herself looking forward to their morning sessions more than she wanted to admit, not only for the steady progress they were making on the translation, but for the easy rhythm that had grown between her and Ronan, something she had not expected to find inside a place built on centuries of guarded tradition. They had moved past the center text and were now working through the final section of the seal, a narrow band of symbols circling the very edge of the stone, smaller and more delicate than anything they had translated before. Lily explained that closing sections in old ceremonial texts often contained practical details, instructions for carrying out whatever process the main text described, rather than grand statements of meaning. She suspected this final ring might explain exactly how a witness was meant to be chosen in the first place. As she worked, Ronan asked her more personal questions than usual, curious about what had drawn her toward such an unusual career, spending her life uncovering messages left behind by people long dead. She told him about her grandfather again, expanding this time on how he had once explained that language was the only true way a person truly lived, beyond their own lifetime, their thoughts and beliefs preserved exactly as they meant them, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen closely enough to understand. Ronan seemed genuinely moved by the idea, admitting quietly that he had spent much of his life focused on duty and expectation, rarely pausing to consider deeper questions about purpose or meaning. He confessed that working alongside her these past days had reminded him that leadership was not only about maintaining order, but also about understanding the deeper truths that shaped the people he was responsible for guiding. Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's sudden intake of breath as she finished translating a key phrase from the outer ring. She read it slowly, checking her work twice before speaking aloud. The text explained that the witness must be chosen from outside the pack entirely, someone with no ties to bloodline, ambition, or established loyalty within Halomir, ensuring their judgment remained completely free from personal interest. The witness would then observe the potential heirs closely, over a period determined by the current leadership, before rendering their final judgment before the full pack. The implications of this passage struck them both at once. Lily was not simply an outside scholar who happened to notice a strange coincidence earlier in the week. According to the ancient agreement, she matched precisely the description of who the witness was meant to be, chosen entirely outside pack ties, brought specifically to examine matters connected to the throne. Whether by design or extraordinary coincidence, her presence at Halomir now carried far greater weight than either of them had initially understood. Ronan sat back slowly, staring at her with an expression caught somewhere between astonishment and quiet unease. He admitted that the timing felt almost impossible to believe, and yet the pattern was undeniable. He had personally requested her research skills through the council months earlier, long before any of this had come to light, without any knowledge of what the seal truly contained. If the ancient text was to be believed, fate or old tradition had somehow guided her directly into the exact role the founders had designed centuries ago. Lily felt the weight of his words settle over her slowly. She had come to Halomir, seeking nothing more than an academic discovery, a rare opportunity to study a forgotten language. She had never imagined she might become personally entangled in the pack's leadership itself, potentially responsible for judgments that could shape their future for generations to come. The thought unsettled her deeply, though beneath the unease, she also felt a quiet pull of purpose she had never experienced before in her academic work. She admitted her uncertainty to Ronan honestly, telling him she was not sure she was equipped to take on such an important responsibility, especially as someone from outside their world entirely, unfamiliar with the deeper customs and expectations of pack life. Ronan listened patiently, then reminded her gently that the ancient founders had specifically wanted someone without deep ties to the pack's internal politics, precisely because that distance allowed for clearer, fairer judgment. Her uncertainty, he suggested, might actually be exactly the quality that made her suited for such a role, rather than a weakness against it. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. Nora entered, her expression tense, explaining quickly that word had reached her of a private council meeting called suddenly for the following morning, organized by Dorian Vale himself. According to what she had overheard, Dorian intended to formally request an investigation into what he called unusual and unsupervised research activity happening within the pack's private quarters, a clear reference to Lily's presence working closely with Ronan. The news landed heavily in the room. Ronan's expression hardened immediately, recognizing that Dorian was moving to force the issue into the open, before Ronan had a chance to control how the information was revealed. If the council convened without proper preparation, rumors and half-truths might spread faster than the actual translated facts, creating exactly the kind of confusion and division the ancient agreement had been designed to prevent in the first place. Lily suggested that instead of allowing Dorian to control the narrative through vague accusations, they should consider presenting the translated findings directly and clearly to the council themselves, framing the discovery honestly rather than reactively. Ronan considered this carefully, weighing the risks of revealing everything before they had finished translating every section completely, against the danger of allowing suspicion and rumor to shape the council's understanding instead. After a long moment of consideration, he agreed that waiting any longer was no longer a safe option. They would need to move quickly, finishing whatever remaining translation they could overnight, preparing themselves as thoroughly as possible before facing the council the following morning. Whatever judgment awaited them, it was clear now that the quiet, careful pace of their research had reached its natural end, replaced instead by the urgent pressure of a decision that could no longer be delayed. As Nora left to gather additional historical records that might support their presentation, Lily and Ronan remained together in the study late into the night, working steadily through the final untranslated fragments, aware that whatever they uncovered next would need to be strong enough to withstand whatever challenge Dorian intended to bring against them at first light. Morning arrived faster than Lily expected, gray light spilling through the study windows, after a night spent poring over the last fragments of the Seal's Edge text. She had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly through symbols and meanings, checking and rechecking her translations, to be certain no error had slipped through in their rush to prepare. Ronan looked equally exhausted when he arrived to collect her, though his expression carried a steadiness that had not been there days earlier, as though the coming confrontation, however difficult, felt easier to face than continued uncertainty. They walked together toward the great hall where the council waited, Lily clutching her notebook tightly against her chest, aware of how much now depended on the clarity of her work. Finn Cole met them at the entrance, his expression grim, warning quietly that Dorian had arrived early, already speaking privately with several council members before the session officially began. Ronan thanked him and squared his shoulders before stepping through the doors, Lily following closely behind. The council chamber was smaller than the main hall, a circular room with high windows and a long table where the PAC's senior members sat waiting, their expressions ranging from curious to openly suspicious. Vera Holt sat near the center, her sharp eyes tracking Lily's entrance carefully. Dorian sat toward one end, composed and confident, clearly prepared for whatever argument he intended to present. Ronan opened the meeting himself, before Dorian had a chance to speak, explaining calmly that he had called this gathering specifically to address rumors that had been circulating about research being conducted within the estate. He introduced Lily formally to the full council, explaining her credentials and the nature of her work, translating the ancient seal above the throne, information that had previously been shared only in limited detail with a few trusted individuals. Murmurs spread quickly around the table as council members absorbed the news that the long-dismissed seal was, in fact, a genuine written language, rather than mere decoration. Dorian rose from his seat immediately, his earlier composure slipping slightly as he interrupted, accusing Ronan of concealing significant information from the council for his own benefit, potentially manipulating an outsider's research to protect his personal claim to leadership. Ronan remained calm under the accusation, responding evenly that concealment had never been his intention, only caution, given how incomplete the translation had been until recently, and how easily half-formed information could be misused or misunderstood if released too quickly. He then turned the discussion over to Lily, asking her to present her findings directly to the council, exactly as she had translated them. Lily stepped forward, her hands steady despite the nervous energy pulsing through her, and began explaining her methodology first, establishing her credentials, and the careful, methodical process she had used to verify each symbol before drawing any conclusions. She then walked the council through her findings step by step, beginning with the outer ring's reference to an unclaimed line and a promise sealed in silence, moving through the hidden marking describing a witness bound by choice rather than blood, and finally reaching the center text describing the ancient process of choosing leadership through impartial judgment rather than strict birthright alone. The room fell silent as she spoke, several council members exchanging uneasy glances as the pieces came together. She finished by explaining the final details she and Ronan had uncovered only hours earlier, that the chosen witness must come from entirely outside the PAC, without ties to bloodline or ambition, and that any judgment rendered by that witness could only be overturned through near-unanimous agreement among the full PAC. Dorian's expression tightened as she spoke, clearly recognizing where her explanation was heading. Before she could finish drawing the connection fully, he interrupted sharply, dismissing her findings as convenient fabrication, suggesting that Ronan had likely influenced her translation to serve his own interests, protecting a claim to leadership that might not withstand honest scrutiny of true bloodline seniority. The accusation stung, and Lily felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed. She reminded the council calmly that her academic reputation depended entirely on accuracy and honesty in her work, and that she had no personal stake whatsoever in the outcome of Halomir's leadership, a fact that, ironically, aligned perfectly with the very qualification the ancient text required of a true witness. Vera Holt spoke for the first time, her voice cutting cleanly through the rising tension. She asked Lily directly whether she believed, based purely on her translation and nothing else, that the ancient agreement suggested leadership should be determined through impartial judgment of character, rather than birth order alone. Lily answered honestly that the text clearly supported that conclusion, though she was careful to clarify that the text did not specify who should currently serve as that witness, only the general requirements of the role. Dorian seized on this immediately, arguing loudly that if the process required a formal witness selection, then no legitimate judgment could be considered valid until that process was properly re-established through full council agreement, effectively challenging Ronan's current leadership as potentially illegitimate under the very tradition Lily had uncovered. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments, council members debating amongst themselves, some defending Ronan's established leadership, others questioning aloud whether the ancient text demanded immediate action to formally reconsider succession. Ronan allowed the discussion to continue for a few moments before raising his hand for silence, his voice carrying clearly over the noise. He addressed the council directly, acknowledging that the discovery raised legitimate questions about tradition and process, questions he had no intention of avoiding or suppressing. Rather than resisting the ancient agreement out of fear, he proposed instead that the council formally recognize the original process, honoring the founder's wisdom by allowing a proper witness evaluation to take place, openly and transparently, rather than being decided through private accusation or political maneuvering. The suggestion clearly surprised several council members, including Dorian, who had likely expected Ronan to resist or dismiss the challenge entirely. Ronan continued, explaining that he welcomed such an evaluation, confident that his leadership over recent years, guided by fairness and dedication to the pack's well-being, would withstand honest scrutiny far better than accusations built on rumor and personal ambition. Vera Holt, after a long moment of consideration, suggested that the council formally appoint Lily as the temporary witness described in the ancient text, given that she already possessed detailed knowledge of the seal's meaning and had no personal ties to either claimant. Several council members voiced agreement, though Dorian objected loudly, arguing that Lily's closeness to Ronan throughout the translation process compromised her impartiality entirely. The room fell into tense debate once again, and Lily realized, with a growing sense of unease, that regardless of how this argument resolved, she had just been thrust unwillingly into the very center of a power struggle that could reshape the entire future of Hallowmere, her own careful academic research now serving as the foundation upon which an ancient and deeply consequential decision would soon be built. The council chamber remained divided long after the initial debate, voices rising and falling as members argued over whether Lily could truly serve as an impartial witness, given her closeness to Ronan throughout the translation process. Vera Holt eventually called for a temporary recess, giving everyone a chance to step away and consider the matter with clearer heads before any formal decision was reached. Lily welcomed the pause, stepping out onto a quiet stone balcony overlooking the packlands, hoping the fresh air might ease the tightness in her chest. She had not expected, when she accepted this research position weeks earlier, to find herself standing at the center of a leadership crisis, her academic findings now carrying consequences far beyond anything she had trained for in her studies of old languages. Ronan joined her a few minutes later, his expression tired but composed. He apologized quietly for the position his family's history had placed her in, admitting that he had never intended for her simple research assignment to become entangled so deeply in matters of succession and power. Lily reassured him that she did not blame him for the situation, understanding that neither of them could have predicted what the ancient seal would reveal once properly translated. He asked her honestly whether she believed she could serve fairly as the witness the council was now considering appointing her to be, especially given how much time they had spent working closely together over recent days. Lily considered the question seriously before answering. She admitted that she had grown to respect him deeply through their work together, but reminded him that respect for his character did not mean she would ignore evidence or reason if the situation truly called for a different conclusion. Her responsibility, she explained, was to judgment based on fairness and observation, not personal preference. Ronan seemed reassured by her answer, though a flicker of something else crossed his expression as well, something quieter and more personal that neither of them addressed directly in that moment. Their conversation was interrupted when Nora hurried onto the balcony, informing them that the council had reconvened and were ready to announce their decision regarding Lily's proposed role as witness. They returned to the chamber together, finding the council members already seated, expressions serious as Vera Holt rose to address the room. She announced that, after careful consideration, the council had voted to formally accept Lily as temporary witness under the ancient agreement, with one important condition. Given concerns about her closeness to Ronan, the council would require a formal evaluation period, during which Lily would observe both Ronan and Dorian directly, assessing their conduct, decisions, and treatment of pack members before rendering any final judgment before the full council. Dorian, though clearly displeased with the outcome, accepted the condition, likely calculating that a structured evaluation period gave him opportunity to present himself favorably and potentially undermine Ronan's standing through careful maneuvering. Ronan accepted as well, his expression steady, despite the obvious pressure now resting on his shoulders. The evaluation period was set to last 2 weeks, during which Lily would shadow both men closely, observing council meetings, community interactions, and daily leadership decisions, gathering enough understanding to render a judgment the ancient agreement required be delivered honestly and without bias before the assembled pack. As the council session ended and members filed out of the chamber, Lily felt the enormous weight of her new responsibility settle firmly onto her shoulders. She was no longer simply a scholar, translating old symbols from a distance. She had become an active participant in a decision that would shape the future of an entire pack, her every observation over the coming 2 weeks, carrying consequences far beyond anything she had ever been asked to evaluate before. Ronan found her afterward in the quiet hallway outside the chamber, his expression carrying a mixture of gratitude and quiet worry. He thanked her for accepting such an unexpected and difficult responsibility, acknowledging that he understood how heavily this new role would weigh on her, especially given how much scrutiny both she and he would now face from every corner of the pack. Lily reassured him that she intended to approach the evaluation with complete fairness, observing him with the same careful scrutiny she would apply to Dorian, regardless of the friendship that had grown between them during their research together. Ronan nodded, understanding fully, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped desperately that fairness alone would be enough to secure the outcome he wanted, both for his leadership and, perhaps, for something else growing quietly between them that neither had yet found the courage to name directly. Over the following days, Lily began her formal observation, attending council sessions where both Ronan and Dorian presented their views on pack matters, watching closely how each man responded to challenges, how they treated pack members who came to them with concerns, and how they handled disagreement among their advisors. She took careful notes, determined to remain as objective as possible despite the personal connection she had developed with Ronan. She noticed quickly that Ronan's leadership style favored patient listening, often taking time to fully understand a concern before offering a decision, even when pressed by advisors to act more quickly. Dorian, by contrast, moved decisively and confidently, but she noticed subtle patterns in how he dismissed concerns raised by lower-ranking pack members, treating their input as less valuable than opinions offered by senior council figures. She also began speaking privately with various pack members outside formal council settings, gathering honest impressions of both men's reputations among ordinary Hallowmere residents rather than relying solely on official interactions. Many spoke warmly of Ronan's fairness, describing instances where he had personally intervened to resolve disputes between families, always taking time to understand every side before offering guidance. Fewer had direct experience with Dorian, though those who did described him as capable but distant, more focused on maintaining appearances than genuinely connecting with those he might one day lead. Despite gathering increasingly clear evidence favoring Ronan's approach to leadership, Lily remained cautious, aware that her own growing feelings for him could easily cloud her judgment if she allowed herself to become careless. She continued documenting every observation meticulously, determined that whatever final judgment she eventually delivered before the full pack would be built entirely on evidence and fairness, rather than personal affection, regardless of how deeply that affection had begun to take root within her heart over the course of their unexpected journey together. By the end of the first week of evaluation, Lily had filled several notebooks with careful observations, comparing patterns of behavior between Ronan and Dorian across dozens of small interactions. She had begun to notice something troubling, however, something that went beyond simple differences in leadership style. Several pack members she interviewed mentioned, almost in passing, that Dorian had recently been offering unusual favors to certain council members, small gifts and private assurances that seemed designed to secure their loyalty ahead of the final judgment. She brought her concerns to Nora, who confirmed that similar rumors had reached her as well. Several junior council members had reportedly been promised expanded influence and resources should Dorian ultimately be granted leadership. Quiet arrangements made outside any official record, clearly intended to build support regardless of what Lily's evaluation eventually concluded. If true, this behavior directly conflicted with the very qualities the ancient agreement valued most: fairness, integrity, and leadership earned through genuine merit rather than political manipulation. Lily understood she needed concrete evidence before including such serious concerns in her final judgment, mere rumor being insufficient for something this consequential. She began paying closer attention during council sessions, watching carefully for any sign of the favoritism Nora had described. It did not take long before she witnessed it herself, a quiet exchange between Dorian and a junior council member following a session, their conversation hushed, and clearly not meant to be overheard. She approached the council member privately afterward, a young man named Elias Ford, and asked him honestly, without accusation, whether he felt any pressure regarding how he should vote once her evaluation concluded. Elias hesitated visibly before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Eventually, he admitted quietly that Dorian had indeed approached him and several others, suggesting that supporting his claim to leadership would result in expanded roles and greater influence within the PAC's future structure, regardless of what any formal evaluation determined. Lily thanked him for his honesty and assured him that whatever information he shared would remain confidential unless he chose otherwise. She recorded his statement carefully, aware that this single piece of evidence, while significant, would need to be corroborated further before she could responsibly include it in her final assessment before the full PAC. Meanwhile, her time observing Ronan continued to reveal a leader deeply invested in his people's genuine well-being rather than political maneuvering. She watched him personally visit a family whose home had been damaged during a recent storm, offering practical help rather than simply delegating the matter to advisors. She observed him listen patiently to an elderly PAC member's lengthy concerns about resource allocation, taking detailed notes and following up personally days later with a thoughtful response, rather than dismissing the conversation as unimportant. These small moments, accumulated over days of careful observation, painted a picture increasingly difficult for Lily to view with pure objectivity, precisely because the evidence itself so strongly supported the growing respect and affection she already felt toward him. She reminded herself constantly to remain critical, searching deliberately for any flaws or missteps in his leadership that might balance her assessment more fairly, rather than allowing her personal feelings to shape her conclusions unchecked. During the second week, tension within the PAC grew increasingly visible, as rumors of the upcoming judgment spread beyond the council chamber into the wider community. PAC members began openly discussing their preferences, some expressing loyalty toward Ronan's established leadership, others intrigued by Dorian's promises of change and expanded opportunity. The division worried Lily deeply, recognizing that regardless of her eventual judgment, healing whatever divide had begun forming within the PAC would require careful, deliberate effort from whoever ultimately held leadership. Late one evening, as she reviewed her accumulated notes in the quiet study, Ronan joined her, settling into the chair across from her with visible exhaustion. He asked, cautiously, how her evaluation was progressing, careful not to press for details he understood she could not yet share. Lily reassured him only that her observations remained ongoing, though she allowed herself to admit, quietly, that she had witnessed nothing during her time watching him that gave her serious concern regarding his character or leadership. Ronan seemed relieved by her words, though he was careful not to assume too much from them. Their conversation drifted naturally from PAC matters into more personal territory, Ronan asking what she intended to do once her role as witness concluded, whether she planned to return immediately to her academic life far from Hallowmere. The question caught Lily off guard, and she realized, with quiet surprise, that she had not fully considered what leaving Hallowmere would actually feel like, now that her time here had grown into something far more meaningful than she had originally expected. She answered honestly that she was not entirely certain what came next for her, admitting that her time at Hallowmere had changed her perspective on many things she once considered settled in her life. Ronan listened closely, something warm and hopeful flickering behind his tired eyes, though neither of them pushed the conversation further that evening. both aware that anything more personal needed to wait until her formal judgment had been properly delivered, free from any appearance of bias or influence. As the evaluation period drew closer to its conclusion, Lily finalized her notes, weighing carefully everything she had witnessed and gathered over the past 2 weeks. She had substantial evidence supporting Ronan's genuine commitment to fair, thoughtful leadership, alongside growing confirmation of Dorian's troubling pattern of political manipulation, designed to secure loyalty through favors rather than earn trust. Still, she understood that presenting this judgment before the full pack would require absolute clarity and confidence, since Dorian would almost certainly challenge any conclusion that did not favor his own ambitions, regardless of how thoroughly her evaluation had been conducted. She spent her final evening before the judgment, gathering her thoughts carefully, organizing her notes into a clear, structured presentation that would leave little room for doubt or misinterpretation. Whatever she decided to say before the assembled pack the following day would permanently shape the future of Hallowmere, and she intended to ensure her words carried the full weight of careful observation, honest evidence, and the impartial judgment the ancient founders had trusted their chosen witness to deliver. The morning of the judgment arrived, with the entire pack gathered inside the great hall, far more crowded than Lily had ever seen it, every corner filled with families, elders, and workers, who rarely had reason to enter the throne room together. Word of the Ancient Seal's translation had spread widely by now, and curiosity, along with genuine concern for the pack's future, had drawn nearly everyone within Hallomere's territory to witness the outcome firsthand. Lily stood near the base of the throne, her notebook held steadily in her hands, watching as Ronan and Dorian took their positions on opposite sides of the hall, both dressed formally, both projecting calm confidence despite the obvious tension radiating from the crowd. Vera Holt called the gathering to order, explaining briefly to those unfamiliar with recent events the discovery of the Ancient Seal's true meaning and the formal evaluation process that had followed. When it came time for Lily to speak, she stepped forward, her heart pounding steadily despite her outward composure. She began by explaining clearly, in simple terms accessible to everyone present, the meaning of the seal above the throne, describing how the ancient founders had established a process requiring leadership to be confirmed not simply through bloodline, but through impartial judgment of character and fairness, verified by a witness chosen specifically from outside the pack's internal politics. She then explained her own unexpected role within that ancient tradition, describing honestly how she had been asked to observe both candidates over the past 2 weeks, evaluating their conduct, decisions, and treatment of pack members before rendering her judgment. She reminded the gathered crowd that her assessment carried weight, not because of personal opinion, but because the very tradition their ancestors had established specifically valued impartial observation over political maneuvering or inherited privilege alone. Turning to her detailed notes, Lily described specific examples she had witnessed during her observation period, careful to present concrete evidence rather than vague impressions. She spoke of Ronan's personal involvement helping a family recover from storm damage, his patient attention toward an elderly resident's concerns, and his consistent willingness to listen fully before making decisions, even when faced with pressure to act more quickly. She then addressed, carefully and without exaggeration, the troubling pattern she had observed in Dorian's conduct, describing the private conversations she had confirmed through direct testimony, where he had offered expanded influence and resources to certain council members in exchange for their loyalty ahead of any formal judgment. She named Elias Ford specifically, having secured his permission beforehand to share his testimony publicly, understanding that concrete evidence would carry far more weight than anonymous rumor. A murmur spread through the crowd as she spoke, several faces turning toward Dorian, whose expression had grown increasingly tense throughout her presentation. He attempted to interrupt, dismissing her account as misunderstanding or exaggeration, but Vera Holt firmly reminded him that the formal evaluation process required him to wait until Lily had finished her complete presentation before responding. Lily continued, explaining that while she had approached her evaluation determined to remain entirely impartial, the evidence she gathered over 2 careful weeks consistently supported one conclusion far more strongly than the other. She stated clearly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, that based on her observations and the standards established by the ancient agreement, she found Ronan Ashford to be the candidate whose leadership most closely honored the values the founders had originally intended to protect: fairness, genuine care for the pack's well-being, and leadership earned through consistent, honest conduct rather than political manipulation. The hall fell into a heavy silence following her declaration, before Dorian finally spoke, his composure cracking slightly as he argued that a single witness, an outsider unfamiliar with the deeper complexities of pack tradition, should not hold such enormous power over Halomir's future leadership. He appealed directly to the crowd, suggesting that bloodline seniority still deserved consideration, regardless of what the ancient text specified. Vera Holt addressed the crowd calmly, reminding everyone present that the ancient agreement specifically protected the witness's judgment from being overturned, except through near-unanimous consent of the full pack, a protection deliberately designed to prevent exactly the kind of political challenge Dorian was now attempting. She called for a formal vote, asking all pack members present who wished to challenge Lily's judgment to step forward and be counted. The hall remained still for a long moment, before only a small handful of individuals, mostly those Lily suspected had already accepted Dorian's earlier favors, stepped forward to voice their objection. The vast majority of the gathered pack remained standing quietly in place, their silence speaking clearly in support of the judgment Lily had delivered. Dorian's expression fell, as he realized the depth of support Ronan genuinely held among the people he hoped to lead, support built through years of honest, patient leadership rather than promises made under pressure. Vera Holt formally announced that the challenge had failed to meet the required threshold for reversal, confirming Ronan Ashford's leadership as fully legitimate, under both traditional bloodline succession and the ancient witness process the founders had established. A wave of quiet relief and murmured approval spread through the hall, tension easing visibly from shoulders that had carried worry for weeks leading up to this moment. Dorian left the hall quietly afterward, his expression carefully composed, despite the obvious sting of defeat, offering no further public challenge to the judgment that had been rendered. Lily watched him go, feeling no satisfaction in his loss, only quiet relief that the pack's future had been decided honestly, through evidence and fairness rather than fear or political manipulation. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about the remarkable morning they had just witnessed, Ronan approached Lily directly, his expression carrying open gratitude and something warmer beneath it that he no longer seemed inclined to hide. He thanked her quietly for the courage and fairness she had shown throughout the entire process, acknowledging that her honest judgment had likely saved Halomir from a painful and divisive struggle that could have fractured the pack for years to come. In the days following the judgment, life within Halomir began settling into a new, steadier rhythm. The initial shock of discovering the Throne Seal's true meaning gradually gave way to quiet acceptance, as pack members began to see the ancient tradition not as a threat to their history, but as proof of how carefully their founders had worked to protect fair and honest leadership for future generations. Council meetings resumed their normal pace, though now with a renewed sense of purpose, several members privately admitting to Vera Holt that the entire experience had reminded them why fairness needed to remain central to how Halomir governed itself moving forward. Lily remained at the estate during this transition period, technically still finishing minor details of her original research assignment, though both she and Ronan understood that her presence now carried far greater meaning than simple academic obligation. She spent her mornings completing formal documentation of her translation work for the pack's official historical records, ensuring that future generations would have clear, accurate understanding of the seal's true significance, rather than allowing it to fade back into vague legend the way it had for centuries before her arrival. Ronan, meanwhile, worked steadily to repair whatever quiet divisions had formed within the pack during the tense weeks of uncertainty. He met personally with council members who had initially supported Dorian's challenge, listening genuinely to their concerns rather than punishing their earlier doubts, understanding that healing the pack required patience and understanding rather than resentment toward those who had simply been uncertain about an unprecedented situation. Elias Ford, in particular, received quiet reassurance from Ronan that his honesty in coming forward, despite personal risk, would be remembered and respected rather than held against him. One quiet afternoon, as Lily finished organizing the final pages of her research documentation in the private study where so much of their earlier work together had taken place, Ronan arrived carrying 2 cups of tea, setting one gently beside her notebook before settling into the chair across from her. Their conversation drifted easily, as it often did now, from practical pack matters into quieter, more personal territory neither of them had fully addressed since the judgment had been delivered. He asked her directly, his voice softer than she had heard it before, whether she had given any further thought to what she intended to do once her research assignment was formally completed. Lily set down her pen, considering the question honestly rather than rushing toward an easy answer. She admitted that her original plan had always been to return to her academic position, continuing her broader research into forgotten dialects across various communities. Yet she found herself reluctant now to imagine simply packing her notebooks and leaving Halomir behind entirely, as though nothing meaningful had happened here beyond the completion of an unusual research project. Ronan listened carefully, then admitted quietly that he had spent considerable time recently trying to find the right words to express what her presence at Halomir had come to mean to him personally, beyond even the enormous service she had provided the pack through her fair and honest judgment. He confessed that working alongside her these past weeks had reminded him what genuine partnership felt like, something he realized he had rarely experienced in his life as Alpha King, surrounded often by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than honest truth, delivered with genuine care. Lily felt her chest tighten with quiet emotion as she listened, recognizing in his words the same growing feelings she had struggled to name clearly within herself over recent weeks. She admitted honestly that she had come to Halomir expecting nothing more than an interesting academic challenge, yet had found herself unexpectedly changed by everything she experienced here, not only through the historical discovery itself, but through the quiet, patient friendship that had grown steadily between them throughout the process. Their conversation paused naturally, comfortable silence settling between them, as both allowed the weight of unspoken feelings to finally surface openly, rather than remaining carefully guarded beneath professional distance. Ronan reached across the table gently, and Lily did not pull away, both understanding, without needing further words, that whatever came next between them would be built on the same foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had guided them safely through the difficult weeks leading up to this quiet moment. In the following weeks, Lily made the decision to remain at Halomir, accepting a newly created position within the pack, dedicated to preserving and properly documenting their ancient history, ensuring that future generations would never again lose understanding of important traditions, the way the seal's meaning had nearly been forgotten. The council welcomed her formally into this role, recognizing both her skill and the genuine trust she had earned throughout the recent crisis. Ronan's leadership, strengthened rather than weakened by the transparency and fairness he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, grew steadier in the months that followed. Pack members who had once quietly doubted his position now spoke of him with renewed confidence, understanding that his willingness to face difficult truths honestly, rather than hiding from them out of fear, reflected exactly the kind of leadership their ancestors had hoped to protect, through the ancient witness tradition, carved carefully into stone, centuries earlier. The throne seal itself remained above the hall, no longer a mysterious, half-forgotten decoration, but a proud reminder of the pack's true founding values, properly translated and understood for the first time in generations. Visitors and pack members alike now paused beneath it with genuine appreciation, aware of the careful wisdom their ancestors had embedded within its ancient symbols, wisdom that had ultimately guided Halomir safely through its greatest test in modern memory. As for Lily, she often found herself standing quietly beneath that same seal in the early mornings, tracing the familiar symbols with her eyes, remembering the tense uncertainty of her first days at Halomir, and marveling at how completely her life had changed since then. What had begun as a simple assignment to translate old, forgotten words had led her instead toward an unexpected home, a meaningful purpose, and a partnership with Ronan, built on the same honesty and fairness the ancient founders had trusted to protect their people for generations to come.